Imagine waking up tomorrow and checking your bank account the same way you always do. The app opens, the numbers are still there, but transfers don't go through instantly anymore. Your employer sends payroll, but it settles a day late. Your credit card works, but the authorization wheel spins longer than usual. At the gas station, the pump pauses before approving your card. At the grocery store, nothing looks empty, but prices have quietly jumped again. Not enough to cause panic, just enough to force hesitation. You tell yourself it's inflation, or a system update, or a temporary glitch. But the feeling doesn't leave, because the system didn't break, it tightened. And tightening systems don't loosen on their own. This isn't a theory or a conspiracy, it's a mathematical certainty. The United States is approaching a $38, $4 trillion shift, a point where debt, interest, and currency stability collide. At this level, the numbers stop being political and start being mechanical. The interest alone grows faster than the economy that must support it. And inside this structure sit 62 million Americans whose lives are tied to fixed payments, fixed incomes, and assets priced by policies they don't control. Mortgages, pensions, retirement accounts, salaries that lag costs. This isn't about fear, it's about math. Let that sink in. Every large-scale financial breakdown follows the same four-act mechanism. Always. Different countries, different centuries, same structure. The stages are simple. The foundation, the trap, the trigger, the cascade. People argue endlessly about the trigger. They miss the point. By the time the trigger appears, the outcome is already locked in. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States has already completed Stage 1 and Stage 2. Stage 1 is the foundation. This is where power is built and mistakes are rewarded. The dollar became the world's reserve currency after World War II. Trade settled in dollars. Energy priced in dollars. Debt issued in dollars. This created permanent global demand. It allowed the United States to borrow cheaply, endlessly, and confidently. For decades, the system worked. Debt rose, but so did productivity. Growth justified borrowing. Living standards climbed. Confidence reinforced itself. The foundation hardened. Then, something changed. Stage 2 is the trap. This is where debt grows faster than the real economy, where interest costs rise faster than wages, where asset prices inflate, not because productivity improves, but because liquidity has nowhere else to go. Homes stop being places to live and become leveraged financial instruments. Stocks stop reflecting earnings and start reflecting central bank policy. Retirement accounts quietly transform into vehicles that require constant asset inflation just to survive. Wages stagnate. Costs don't. Sound familiar? At this stage, the system becomes fragile in a very specific way. Falling prices are no longer acceptable. They threaten homeowners. They threaten pensions. They threaten banks. So policy shifts from managing growth to preventing decline. Rates can't rise without breaking borrowers. Rates can't fall without weakening the currency. So the system oscillates, tighten, loosen, print, pause, each cycle larger than the last. Each intervention borrowing stability from the future. This is the trap. Because once enough people depend on asset inflation to survive, there is no clean exit left. And that's where we are now. Stage 3 is the trigger. This is the part everyone waits for, the headline event, the shock. But the trigger is never the cause. It's just the moment denial ends. A treasury auction that struggles, a foreign buyer that doesn't show up, a yield spike that policy can't fully suppress. It will look technical, boring even, but it will reveal something critical, that the system requires constant intervention just to function. And once that illusion breaks, Stage 4 begins. Stage 4 is the cascade. Not an explosion, a chain reaction. Liquidity dries up unevenly, credit tightens selectively. Some markets keep working, others freeze. Trust doesn't disappear overnight, it fractures. And fractured systems don't collapse loudly, they grind down quietly. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Spain learned this centuries ago. In the 16th century, Spain controlled the dominant monetary input of its era, silver. Galleons arrived loaded with it from the New World. The crown believed wealth had been secured permanently. Unlimited silver meant unlimited power. But silver didn't create productivity, it destroyed it. Prices rose faster than wages. Domestic industry collapsed because imports were cheaper. Debt exploded because money felt abundant. Spain didn't fall because it ran out of silver. It fell because silver replaced discipline. By the time the empire realized what was happening, the currency still existed, but the economic base beneath it was hollow. Britain followed the same pattern later. The pound sterling ruled global trade. London was the financial center of the world. Britain financed wars, built infrastructure, and expanded influence through debt. World War I weakened the system. World War II finished it. Britain survived militarily, but the financial cost was fatal. Debt levels became unpayable without surrendering reserve currency dominance. The pound didn't collapse overnight. It faded quietly, through balance sheets, through repayments that stretched decades into the future. Let that sink in. Reserve currencies don't die in chaos. They erode through arithmetic. Now look at the present. U.S. Treasury data shows interest expense rising faster than nearly every major spending category. Faster than defense. Faster than healthcare. This isn't a policy choice. It's a structural reality. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet tells another story. Trillions created to stabilize markets. Partial reversals. Then expansions again. Each cycle leaving the baseline higher than before. This isn't tightening. It's controlled instability. At the same time, something subtle is happening globally. Central banks are buying gold at record levels, not traders, not speculators. Central banks, China, Russia, emerging economies, even traditional allies. Meanwhile, foreign demand for long-term U.S. Treasuries has softened, not collapsed, just retreated. SEC filings show large institutions shortening bond duration, reducing long-term exposure, quietly repositioning. No press conferences, no panic, just preparation. This is what smart money does. It doesn't argue with cycles. It moves before headlines force everyone else to. And this is where people reach for the most dangerous phrase in financial history. This time is different. They say technology will save the system. Artificial intelligence, automation, productivity gains. They say military power protects the currency, or innovation, or confidence. But Rome had engineering. Spain had silver. Britain had industry and empire. None of them escaped the cycle. Technology changes speed. It doesn't change math. The math doesn't care about optimism. And that brings us back to the 62 million Americans caught inside this structure. They aren't reckless. They aren't ignorant. They're structurally exposed. Mortgages priced off manipulated rates. Pensions dependent on asset inflation. Savings denominated in a currency that must lose purchasing power to remain solvent. When adjustment comes, it won't arrive as collapse. It will arrive as management, limits, incentives, quiet restrictions that feel temporary at first. This is not the end. By the time most people realize that something is wrong, the argument has already shifted. Not whether the system is stressed, but how bad it really is. That's always the moment history becomes useful. Because this phase has played out before. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. Under different flags, different currencies, same mechanics. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. When systems reach this point, they don't collapse from chaos. They collapse from exhaustion. And look back at Spain again, but this time focus on the ending. Spain didn't lose its empire because silver disappeared. Silver kept flowing. What disappeared was productive capacity. Why build industry when imports were cheaper? Why tax carefully when treasure ships arrived every year? The state learned to spend before it learned to produce. Debt filled the gap. Inflation followed. Confidence lingered longer than reality. And when confidence finally broke, it didn't matter how much silver Spain still had. The system no longer trusted itself. Sound familiar? Britain's decline followed a quieter rhythm. The pound remained strong on paper long after the empire's finances were broken. Britain didn't default. It didn't hyperinflate. It honored its debts, and that's exactly why the damage lasted so long. A generation of austerity, capital controls, rationing, declining influence. The loss wasn't sudden, it was structural. Britain paid the price for its financial overreach for decades. Let that sink in. Now fast forward to the United States. The first smoking gun is U.S. Treasury data. Official numbers, not opinions. Interest expense on the national debt is rising faster than almost every major spending category. Faster than defense, faster than healthcare, faster than economic growth. That means more borrowing is required just to service existing debt. That is the definition of a debt spiral. Not collapse, spiral. The system still functions, but it requires constant motion to avoid falling. The second smoking gun sits in SEC filings, institutional disclosures, pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers. Look at what they're doing, not what they're saying. Duration is shrinking. Exposure to long-term bonds is being reduced. Liquidity is being prioritized over yield. This isn't panic, it's repositioning. Large institutions move first because they have to. They can't exit all at once. They prepare quietly. That's how smart money behaves at turning points. The third smoking gun is visible in central bank reserve data. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. This is not speculation. Central banks don't chase trends. They hedge systemic risk. Gold doesn't yield. It doesn't grow. It doesn't innovate. It simply sits outside the system. When central banks increase gold reserves while reducing reliance on foreign debt, they're sending a signal. Not about tomorrow, about the next phase. Put these three together. Rising interest burden, institutional repositioning, central bank hedging. This is not coincidence, this is pattern alignment. And yet, the most common response is denial dressed as confidence. This time is different. We hear it every cycle. Technology will save us. Artificial intelligence will unlock productivity. Innovation will outrun debt. Military power will defend the currency. Confidence will sustain demand. But history is ruthless on this point. No empire has ever escaped arithmetic through innovation alone. Rome had concrete, roads, aqueducts. It still debased its currency. Spain had silver, Britain had industry. None of it stopped the cycle. Technology changes the slope, not the direction. Military power doesn't protect purchasing power. It protects borders. Currencies fail quietly while armies remain strong. The British Empire still had the largest navy in the world when the pound lost reserve dominance. Rome still had legions when its currency collapsed. Power lags finance, always. What actually breaks systems like this isn't a single event. It's the accumulation of constraints, policies that feel temporary but become permanent, incentives that nudge behavior instead of forcing it, limits that appear reasonable in isolation but devastating in aggregate. This is how the trap closes. For the 62 million Americans tied to fixed structures, the danger isn't losing everything overnight. It's being unable to adjust. Mortgages lock you into payments while prices inflate. Pensions promise stability while returns become policy dependent. Savings lose purchasing power while yields stay capped. You're not wiped out, you're compressed, trapped between rising costs and controlled returns. Sound familiar? This is the point where narratives change. Growth stories fade. Stability stories emerge. Officials talk about resilience, about long-term adjustments, about shared sacrifice. These phrases appear in every late-stage cycle. They're not lies, they're signals. And this is where the cascade begins, not all at once, selectively. Credit becomes harder to access for some groups, not everyone. Certain sectors feel it first: commercial real estate, small businesses, municipal finances. Then the pressure spreads, defaults rise quietly, bailouts appear with conditions. Liquidity returns, but only where policy wants it to go. This isn't free markets anymore, it's managed outcomes. People expect collapse to look dramatic. It rarely does. More often, it looks administrative. Forms, rules, delays, incentives, penalties. 1,000 small frictions replacing one big shock. The system doesn't break, it tightens. And once tightening becomes normal, reversal becomes impossible. This is where belief becomes dangerous. Belief that innovation will arrive in time. Belief that growth will outrun debt. Belief that history somehow exempted this cycle. But cycles don't care about belief. They resolve the same way every time. Through adjustment, through redistribution, through loss of optionality. The only question is who absorbs the cost? And that question leads directly to what comes next. Because once the cascade is underway, the discussion shifts from diagnosis to survival. Not panic, preparation, not escape, positioning. That's where this is heading. This is not the end of the story. It's the turning point. This is where the story usually breaks down. Not because the danger disappears, but because people reach for comfort. They say the same words every time a system reaches this stage. This time is different. They say technology will save us. Artificial intelligence, automation, productivity miracles. They say military power will protect the currency, that global demand will never fade, that confidence alone can sustain value. History is merciless on this point. Rome had technology, roads that lasted 2,000 years, engineering no rival could match. It still debased its currency, still inflated, still collapsed. Spain had silver flowing in faster than any economy had ever seen. It still hollowed itself out. Britain had industry, empire, and the world's most powerful navy. It still lost reserve currency status and spent decades paying for past excesses. Military strength did not protect purchasing power. Innovation did not erase debt. Confidence did not override arithmetic. Sound familiar? Technology does not cancel interest. It does not erase obligations. It only changes the speed at which systems adjust. And faster systems don't escape cycles. They reach the end sooner. Military power doesn't save currencies either. It enforces borders, not balance sheets. Currencies fail quietly while armies remain intact. Always have. Always will. The uncomfortable truth is this. Once a system reaches the late stages of a debt cycle, there are only three paths forward: default, inflation, or control. Modern systems choose the third because it looks the least violent. It preserves appearances. It spreads pain quietly. It turns losses into policies instead of events. That is the trap the Federal Reserve is managing right now. Rates can't rise too far without breaking borrowers. Rates can't fall too much without breaking the currency. So policy becomes a balancing act. Liquidity is injected, then withdrawn. Inflation is tolerated, then talked down. Stability is promised while purchasing power erodes. The system doesn't implode, it constrains. And constraint is where people lose freedom without noticing. This is why the 62 million Americans at the center of this shift matter so much. They are not speculators. They are households, retirees, workers, people whose wealth is locked into structures that assume stability. Mortgages assume predictable money. Pensions assume manageable inflation. Salaries assume purchasing power holds. When those assumptions break, there is no dramatic collapse. There is gradual suffocation. Let that sink in. This is not about timing markets. It's about understanding position. And once you understand position, the question becomes simple. What do you do when the system tightens instead of breaks? That's where the survival roadmap begins. The first step is diversification out of a single monetary outcome. This does not mean abandoning dollars. It means not being trapped entirely inside them. When all assets, income, and savings depend on one policy path, you are exposed. Diversification isn't about returns at this stage. It's about optionality, the ability to move, the ability to adapt. The second step is liquidity with intent. You're not cash for comfort, cash for flexibility. Liquidity gives you choice when others have none. It allows you to absorb shocks without selling assets at the worst possible moment. It allows you to wait while others are forced to act. In late cycle systems, liquidity is not lazy, it's defensive. The third step is reducing dependence on leverage. Debt is manageable when the system expands. It becomes lethal when the system constrains. Fixed payments don't adjust when income weakens. Variable rates don't care about your expectations. Reducing leverage doesn't mean panic selling. It means understanding which obligations lock you in and which give you room to breathe. The fourth step is geographic and institutional diversification. Systems fragment unevenly. Some regions stabilize faster than others. Some institutions adapt better than others. Keeping everything tied to one jurisdiction, one regulatory regime, one policy authority is a risk most people don't see until it's too late. This isn't about fleeing, it's about redundancy. The fifth step is investing in human capital. Skills, adaptability, networks. In every historical cycle, the people who fare best are not those with the most assets, but those with the most flexibility. Skills that translate, knowledge that compounds, relationships that create opportunity when systems reorganize. When money becomes constrained, capability becomes currency. And the final step is psychological preparedness. This matters more than most people realize. Late cycle environments punish denial. They reward realism. Understanding that stability is no longer guaranteed changes how you make decisions. It changes time horizons. It changes risk tolerance. It changes what you consider success. None of these steps are about beating the system. They are about surviving its adjustment. Because here is the part few people want to hear. There is no clean reset, no single event that clears the slate, no dramatic collapse that allows everything to start fresh. What comes instead is a long period of managed decline in purchasing power, rising controls, and narrowing options. Not dramatic enough to revolt against, just uncomfortable enough to reshape behavior. This is how systems end in the modern world, quietly, administratively, through incentives and constraints rather than chaos. The Federal Reserve's role in this is not villainous. It's mechanical. The Fed is not choosing between good and bad outcomes. It's choosing between bad and worse. And in doing so, it will always prioritize system stability over individual purchasing power. That is its mandate. That is its function. Once you understand that, the confusion disappears. The $38.4 trillion shift is not a headline. It's a process. A rebalancing that cannot be avoided because it is baked into the numbers. The 62 million Americans caught inside it are not unlucky. They are early in a cycle that hasn't finished expressing itself yet. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And every rhyme ends the same way. With adjustment, with loss, with a new equilibrium that looks nothing like the old one. The question is not whether this happens. The math already answered that. The question is whether you recognize the pattern early enough to position yourself accordingly. Because when the cascade finishes, there's no rewind, only aftermath. And that's where this story ends.